In the Black Sea, close to the Danube Delta, around 21 miles from the Ukrainian coast, lies Snake Island, also sometimes referred to as Serpent Island, White Island, Zmiiny Island, or the Island of Achilles. This tiny piece of land doesn't look like much, but it is the site of one of Ukraine's most impactful battles against Russia, following the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. So join us for this documentary as we examine the Battle of Snake Island, Ukraine's boldest stand. Welcome to Wars of the World. Tensions between Russia and the Ukraine have been building since around 2014, after the Ukrainian parliament voted overwhelmingly in favour of entering into an association agreement with the European Union, a contract that had been in the works for some years. As news of this potential agreement began to spread, Russia pressured Ukraine to reject it, and subsequently issued economic sanctions on the country. In September of 2013, a Russian government advisor stated that if Ukraine were to enter into this agreement, Russia would no longer acknowledge the country's borders. 2 short months later, the Ukrainian president, Viktor Yanukovych, withdrew from signing the agreement, leading to a massive uprising between November 2013 and February 2014, in which thousands of protesters made their displeasure known. These protesters gathered inside Kiev's Independence Square, and the protests were known as the Euromaidan. At its peak, over 500,000 protesters had gathered. In February, 108 protesters were killed by government forces due to intense and violent clashes. Ultimately, President Yanukovych was removed from his position. In early 2014, Russian soldiers bearing no insignia were stationed in Crimea, a Ukrainian territory, and a short time later they were able to seize its parliament. In March, the territory was annexed by the Russians. During the following month, fighting began after Russian mercenaries had seized Sloviansk in eastern Ukraine. Over the next few years, several negotiations and ceasefires were held, but none were able to put a stop to the conflict. In the spring of 2021, Russia began building up its military along the Ukrainian border. Then, later that year, Russian President Vladimir Putin published an essay in which he spoke of how Ukraine is, quote, historically Russian lands, adding that there was no historical basis for the idea of Ukrainian people as a nation separate from Russians. This essay was widely criticized by political scientists and historians, who noted that it contained themes of imperialism, historical revisionism, and other disinformation. Russia subsequently issued a warning to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, also known as NATO, making heavy demands that included not allowing Ukraine to join their alliance. But these demands were dismissed, and there has been much speculation by political analysts that Russia knew that its orders would not be met, giving them a pretext to invade Ukraine. Though NATO attempted to cut deals with Russia, including offering improved military transparency if the country's military buildup near Ukraine stopped, these negotiations ultimately failed. Snake Island is located around 21 miles off the Ukrainian coast and spans 0.066 square miles. The island takes the rough shape of the letter X, and the terrain is difficult, with a lack of fresh water and very hard ground, which makes living there difficult. Notably, there were people living there before the 2022 capture by the Russians. A small village by the name of Bile had been set up in 2007 to house Ukrainian soldiers who were stationed there. Snake Island is also steeped in Greek mythology, and there are all sorts of tales surrounding it. One Greek myth states that the island was created by Poseidon for Achilles to inhabit, as well as for sailors to have an island to anchor in this part of the Black Sea, though legends state that sailors should never sleep on the island. Many of these tales state that the island was designed to be a home for Achilles, hence how it came by one of its names as the Island of Achilles. Over the years, ownership of the island has changed hands several times. It once belonged to Russia, beginning in 1812, but was returned to the Ottoman Empire in 1856. It then became part of Romania over 20 years later, in 1878, before the Soviet Union took it over in 1948, with Romania having ceded it. After the dissolution of the Soviet Union, there was some back and forth of ownership and boundaries of the island between Romania and Ukraine. A treaty was eventually signed in 1997 between the two countries, which saw Romania recognize Ukrainian sovereignty over the land. The International Court of Justice eventually settled these matters, giving Romania 9,700 square kilometers of the disputed maritime territory, and giving Ukraine the remaining 2,300 square kilometers. In the months following NATO's refusal of Russian demands in 2021, fighting in the Donbas region escalated in an attempt to provoke Ukraine into retaliating, although their president, Volodymyr Zelensky, stated that he would not respond to such provocations. In the days before Russia had invaded Ukraine, they continued to share disinformation, with their state media showing fabricated footage of Ukrainian troops supposedly attacking Russians in Donbas. Then in February, the Russians shelled a kindergarten school in Ukrainian-held territory and blamed it on Ukrainian forces. Later that same month, Putin continued to push the idea that Ukraine should not be its own sovereign territory, and that, quote, modern Ukraine was entirely created by Russia. Over the next few days, things would move fast. Ukraine entered a state of emergency. Russia began evacuating its embassy in Kiev, and Zelensky appealed to Russian citizens to prevent a full-scale conflict. But on the morning of February 24, 2022, Vladimir Putin would declare war. Later that day, Ukrainian state border guards raised the alarm that Snake Island, the small island off the Ukrainian coast, was under attack by several Russian watercraft, including the cruiser Moskva and the patrol ship Vasily Baikov. The Russians sought to capture the island as part of a bid for control of the Black Sea. One of the most notable incidents during this early seizure of the island was when Russian forces ordered the Ukrainian residents to surrender. They stated, quote, "This is a military warship. This is a Russian military warship. I suggest you lay down your weapons and surrender to avoid bloodshed and needless casualties. Otherwise, you will be bombed." In response, a border guard named Roman Hrybov reportedly replied, quote, "Russian warship, go fuck yourself." The audio clip of this exchange was widely shared in Ukraine and was verified by government officials, and the famed interaction eventually became a rallying cry, not just for Ukraine, but by the country's supporters worldwide. That evening, it was reported that communication with Snake Island had been lost, and at 10 p.m, it was announced that the land had been captured by Russian troops, following a chaotic naval and air bombardment that left its only village in shambles, destroying all infrastructure. Following this, Russian soldiers landed and took full control. 2 days later, the Russian Ministry of Defense claimed that the US had been involved in a recent attack on their men near to Snake Island, stating, quote, "On the evening of February 25th, during the evacuation of 82 Ukrainian servicemen who voluntarily laid down their arms from Zmiiny Island, 16 boats of the Ukrainian Navy, using swarm tactics, tried to attack the ships of the Black Sea Fleet. During the attack by Ukrainian boats over the provocation area, US strategic unmanned aerial vehicles RQ-4 Global Hawk and MQ-9A Reaper were overhead. They then concluded it is highly likely that it was American UAVs that had directed Ukrainian boats at the ships of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. The US then responded by denying being involved with Ukrainian naval operations near the island, and alleged that this story was a lie made up by the Russian Ministry of Defense. Later that same day, the Ukrainian authorities announced that a civilian search and rescue ship had been captured by the Russians, located just off of Snake Island. On April 13th, a Facebook user with ties to the military posted that Russia's large cruiser, the Moskva, had been severely damaged, writing, quote, "The cruiser Moskva has just been hit by 2 Neptune missiles. It is standing, not sunk, burning, and there is a storm at sea. Tactical flooding is required, apparently." This post was the first report made about the attack on the ship, and an official response came later that evening, when a presidential advisor reported that indeed the watercraft was on fire in rough seas. Odessa Governor Maxim Marchenko announced a short time later that Ukrainian forces had hit the ship using 2 R-360 Neptune anti-ship missiles, causing, quote, "very serious damage." Hours after Marchenko's statement, the Russian Military of Defense confirmed that there was a fire on board the Moskva, which had caused ammunition to explode, seriously damaging the watercraft. However, this official statement declined to mention how this had happened, and made no mention of the Ukrainian strike. The following day, on April 14th, Russian officials had added that the Moskva's missile systems were undamaged, and that the fire had been contained. Efforts were now being made to tow the cruiser to port, but they later announced that it had sunk while in the process. The Russian media claimed that the sinking was simply due to stormy seas. On April 15th, a US defense official concluded that the ship had been hit by 2 Neptune missiles, as the Ukrainians had claimed. At the time, it was about 65 miles south of Odessa, and had been struck by a land-based launcher in the area. Notably, the Moskva was equipped with an air defense system which would have allowed the crew to strike back with electronic jamming, decoys, surface-to-air missiles, or its close-in weapon systems, but none of these were activated. One journalist suggested that this was a result of either the ship's detection system failing, or that the crew was not trained enough to recognize and engage with the oncoming threat. A Russian military journalist and critic of Putin, Arkady Babchenko, reportedly claimed that a Ukrainian drone had disabled the ship's radar system so that it could not detect the missiles, but he did not provide a source for this information. Meanwhile, a Danish military analyst offered the explanation that operator fatigue had contributed to the destruction of the Moskva, as Russians' old-fashioned systems are robust and work well, but require the crew to be alert and responsive. There are mixed reports about the casualties that took place following the attack on the Moskva. There was believed to be around 485 crew members on board, and according to Lithuania's defense minister, a distress signal had been sent out from the ship that day. A Turkish ship had responded and evacuated 54 people at around 2 AM, an hour before the watercraft sank completely. While both the US and Ukrainian officials reported that there were casualties, it's unknown how many. The Russians, meanwhile, claimed that the crew had been evacuated and did not immediately report any casualties at all, although some civilians with family in the military were reportedly told that their loved ones were missing. On April 22nd, they declared that 1 person had been killed, 27 were missing, and 396 had been rescued. The family of crew members, however, believe that the death toll is higher than authorities let on, adding that they have never received official information regarding the fate of their family members. That same day, a member of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine claimed that of the crew members, only 54 had been rescued. The attack and subsequent sinking of the Moskva is described as a significant and humiliating loss to Putin in particular. In the aftermath of its destruction, as the Moskva was the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet, 5 other warships were moved further away from the Ukrainian coast, leaving Snake Island exposed and available for recapture. On the 1st of May, the Ukrainian Air Force Command South launched an attack on Snake Island that destroyed Russian equipment still stationed there. In the previous days, strikes on the island by Ukraine had left at least 2 Strela-10 anti-aircraft missile complexes destroyed and had killed 42 Russian soldiers. On May 2nd, it was reported that 2 Russian Raptor patrol boats had been sunk using a Turkish-supplied Baykar Bayraktar TB2 drone, and video footage was released which showed the ships being sunk by guided bombs. In the following days, further footage was revealed by Ukrainian officials. One video showed another Baykar drone obliterating a Russian Cerner-class landing craft, from which 2 Tor surface-to-air missile launchers were being unloaded, and as a result of the blast, these launchers were also destroyed. Hours later, a Ukrainian drone strike was carried out on a Russian Mi-8 helicopter stationed on Snake Island. Notably, this made for the first known aerial kill by a drone. A further 2 or 3 Raptor-class patrol boats were also destroyed a short time later. Meanwhile, the Russian Ministry of Defense made claims that they've been able to rebuff Ukrainian attempts to retake the island. And around this time, Ukraine stated that it had lost 10 troops and 1 assault craft during the events of May 7th. On May 9th, the Ukrainian presidential advisor stated that it was in fact a useful thing that Russia were holding the island, as it meant that Ukraine could repeatedly strike them. A report from the BBC, dated May 11th, writes about unsubstantiated Russian claims that Ukraine had sustained massive losses during its attempts to recapture the island. The article also discussed the strategic importance of the island in a bid for control of the Black Sea, with Ukrainian military expert Oleh Zhdanov stating, quote, "If Russian troops succeed in occupying Snake Island and set up their long-range air defense systems, they will control the sea, land, and air in the northwest part of the Black Sea and in the south of Ukraine." Zhdanov then added that a reinforced Russian presence would leave Ukraine in a grim position. By this point, the country had already been forced to close its port in Odessa, which was vital for exports, and there were fears amongst government officials that if Russia maintained its grasp on Snake Island, it would be used as a second front line. Zhdanov noted, quote, "If the Russians succeed in installing long-range air defense systems, then they will be able to defend their squadron, which can reach Ukraine's coastline." Other experts interviewed for the article included Romanian historian Dorin Dobrințiu, who warned that if the Russians were able to place a missile system on the island, it would be a threat not just to Odessa and Ukraine as a whole, but also to members of NATO, such as Romania and Bulgaria. He observed, quote, "This is very important for the Romanian government and people, but also for the entire alliance. Russia would have the capacity to destroy cities and military capability in the east of our territory. As well as being dangerous physically, the idea of Russia controlling this island would also be a financial threat to the countries that use the Black Sea to transport their goods." Russian military political analyst Alexander Mikhailov stated, quote, "If there's a military base or military infrastructure, it would be possible to block ships that enter the river as well as leave." There was some speculation that Russia might decide to annex the island, allowing it to control numerous Black Sea shipping routes. Across the rest of May and into June, there were various reports made by both the Russians and the Ukrainians. On May 12th, Ukraine alleged that it had attacked an enemy logistics ship close to the island while it was attempting to deliver an air defense system. The assault was successful, prompting the ship to catch fire and to be towed back to Crimea. However, Russian officials did not comment on the event, nor did they offer up any reports of casualties. Then, 4 days later, the Russians alleged that a Ukrainian Su-24 aircraft was shot down near Snake Island. Then finally, on June 1st, Ukraine alleged that enemy forces had installed several rocket launchers on the island. On June 17th, Ukraine sank a Russian rescue tug, utilizing 2 Harpoon missiles to do so. This maneuver stopped the watercraft from delivering necessary supplies, including weapons and further troops, and prompted the Russians to reconsider their strategy and placement on the island. According to their official report, there were 33 crew members aboard this rescue tug, and 23 were injured, while the remaining 10 were missing in the aftermath of the attack. Just 3 days later, Ukraine targeted gas platforms close to the island, which they believed were being utilized by the Russians. The resulting explosion was so loud that people in Vilkov, the nearest Ukrainian settlement, could reportedly hear it. One woman, a tour guide in the city named Svetlana, told The Guardian, quote, "It was horrible. The planes were flying over our heads, and the blasts were very loud. Some windows cracked in older homes with wooden frames." The greatest difficulty that Ukrainian civilians in the area had faced during this battle was that they had been forbidden from fishing, and this had hit numerous communities extremely hard, including those in the city of Vilkov, known as the Ukrainian Venice, which survives almost solely on the fishing trade. Svetlana stated, quote, "This town belongs to the fishermen, and they were not allowed to even sail out, and fishing is their main source of income, so they suffered great financial losses. In addition, almost 25% of local residents were involved in tourism. Some were offering boat rides, some owned small tourist firms, and some worked as guides, and now it is impossible. As a result, about 80% of locals who were involved in water tourism or fishing are suffering. My husband was fishing, and now we are out of business. We have no income." Strikes on Snake Island continued the following day. Ukraine claimed during this time that they had obliterated numerous military vehicles, along with anti-aircraft and radar systems, something that Russian officials deny. Russia reported that they had intercepted and countered many of Ukraine's attacks, and in the process had destroyed 13 drones and rebuffed amphibious assaults, although some media outlets noted that they were skeptical of these claims, as Ukrainian movements were often backed up with photo evidence, while Russian claims were not. In late June, a Ukrainian Air Force Su-24 MR was shot down during an operation on Snake Island, but both the pilot and the navigator were able to eject and survive the attack. The following day, on the 27th, Ukrainian officials released footage of their troops conducting 10 precision strikes on the island. Another missile system was destroyed during this assault, though the Russian Ministry of Defense argued that it had not. They subsequently claimed that this system had in fact destroyed 12 Ukrainian rockets, as well as a Su-25 aircraft. During the last week of June, Ukraine continued a barrage of attacks against Russian forces both on and around the island. The constant bombardment of Russia's resupply ships made it increasingly difficult for them to remain on the island. The Russians retaliated by having forces stationed in Odessa attack Ukrainian rocket and artillery positions in an attempt to reduce the number and intensity of the assaults. During one such incident, 3 air-to-surface missiles were dispatched, but Ukraine reported that no casualties or damage took place. On the 29th, Ukrainian officials reported having destroyed one of 4 Russian helicopters who approached the island as part of a search and rescue operation. On June 30th, the Russians realized the difficulty of their situation and retreated from the island. They portrayed their pullout as a gesture of goodwill and added that they had simply done everything that they needed to on the island. As part of the reason for their pullout, the Russians claimed, quote, "In order to organize humanitarian grain corridors as part of the implementation of joint agreements reached with the participation of the UN, the Russian Federation has decided to leave its position on Zmiiny Island." Ukraine's military, meanwhile, alleged that they had in fact fled the island using 2 speedboats following several days of consistent attacks. Ukrainian officials stated that their win in the battle for Snake Island would weaken any plans that Russia might have for a future land attack on that stretch of the coastline. The Ukrainians fully recaptured the island on July 4th and raised a Ukrainian flag over it. In the following week, however, the Russians continued to assault the Ukrainian presence on the island. On the 7th, they claimed that a missile strike had been carried out, although Ukrainian sources noted that there were no casualties, but a pier was seriously damaged. Months later, in February 2023, 2 Russian bombers carried out airstrikes against the island. In December 2022, news outlet CNN reported that they were invited to visit the island for the first time since it was recaptured by Ukraine. They described the area as barren and treeless, nothing more than grass and rock, and noted that the hour-long boat ride out was not only hazardous, but also done so in sub-freezing temperatures. The island is now home to unexploded mines and other military equipment, as well as the remains of a Russian helicopter that was shot down. It is also inhabited by several cats, likely former pets of the residents who used to live there. Following the end of the battle, Ukraine kept a small military presence on the island as part of an observation operation. One of the members of the team stationed there was notably a Russian who had volunteered with the Ukrainian forces. He told CNN reporters that there wasn't much Russian activity in the area since they were pushed out of the island. He stated, quote, "At this stage, Russians only perform airstrikes, so we can hear them coming. Plus, we have observers all along the perimeter, and we receive intelligence, so we usually are warned about a possible attack. Conditions on the island are harsh, in part due to the lack of water and infrastructure. The soldiers stationed there are unable to contact their families, because even when there is a signal, turning on one's phone prompts an enemy airstrike. Additionally, sometimes the small supply boats can't make the trip, delaying the troops for as much as a week at a time. The man who led the operation to force the Russians off the island is identified only as Shakespeare in his CNN interview. He reported that most of the work was done in May after Russian positions became exposed, and he stated, quote, "It was all about choosing the right kind of artillery and the combination of artillery." He then added, "The Russians made a mistake in estimating that we cannot reach them while they were here. They thought we could only fire multiple rocket launchers at them, so they installed anti-air systems on the island. They were able to intercept our rockets, but we used complex strikes. They lost manpower and lots of expensive vehicles for nothing. This was their main mistake." The Center for European Policy Analysis, or CEPA, notes that Snake Island is a difficult territory to defend. The ground is too hard and difficult for underground shelters to be built, while the small size of the area makes it difficult for troops and equipment to be moved around. It is particularly vulnerable to both air and naval fire, and requires strategic air defense to resist being captured again. Russian military experts reportedly admitted after the recapture of the island, quote, "It is easy to capture the point. It is more difficult to hold it. More so if significantly more substantial opposing forces are located in the region." Though the island is closer to Ukraine-held territories than it is to Russian territories, long-range artillery from the Russians still poses a threat to the Ukrainians who control it, hence the need for a competent air defense strategy. CEPA has also noted that Russia is no stranger to last-minute land grabs before a peace treaty is signed, and the organization has warned over the danger that might come with a potential ceasefire in the future. The loss of the cruiser Moskva is said to have been a great help in turning down the threat level of Russian naval power. Experts have stated that it's likely due to the destruction of this leading watercraft and a lack of air power above the island that spurred the Ukrainian military into action in order to recapture it. Furthermore, Russian forces were likely hampered by the Battle of Mykolaiv, which began on February 26, 2022, and saw the Russians invade the Mykolaiv Oblast before being repelled by the Ukrainians during the following month. The Russians' preoccupation with this conflict likely contributed to the isolation of those who remained on Snake Island. Ukraine's success in the battle over this island is also in part thanks to Western weapon supplies, including the French Caesar self-propelled howitzer and Harpoon anti-ship missiles, as well as the destruction of resupply ships which forced the Russians to flee. Shortly after Russia captured Snake Island in February 2022, the Ukrainian government stated that it believed around 13 border guards, who made up most of the country's military presence on the island, were killed upon refusing to surrender. President Zelensky announced that those men would be posthumously awarded the title of Hero of Ukraine. However, Russian officials disagreed with Ukraine's version of events, claiming that 82 members of the Ukrainian military had been taken prisoner after surrendering voluntarily, and subsequently they were transported to Sevastopol in Crimea. This led the State Border Guard Service of Ukraine to consider that the missing individuals may have indeed been taken prisoner, rather than being killed outright. The Ukrainian Navy later announced that this was correct. All of the border guards had been detained by the Russian Navy and were now being held as prisoners of war. On March 24, 2022, some weeks later, 19 Ukrainian civilians, as well as the search and rescue ship that had been captured by the Russians 1 month earlier, were both released as part of a prisoner exchange deal. 10 prisoners of war were also delivered to Ukrainian custody. 6 days later, Roman Hribov, the same border guard who coined the famed Ukrainian battle phrase, was released and awarded a medal. But this wouldn't be the last time that the Ukrainian military members who'd fought on Snake Island would be celebrated. In March 2022, a postage stamp was designed to honor the soldiers on Snake Island. The design was publicly voted on, and Ukrainians chose that of artist Boris Gros, who featured a Ukrainian soldier standing on a beach and giving the middle finger to a passing Russian warship. Furthermore, that following year, a street in Kiev was named Heroes of Snake Island. Further prisoner exchanges would later be carried out in January 2024. Thank you for watching today's video. If you found it informative, please leave a like or a comment down below. All of our content, from the research and script writing to the editing and narration, is completely human-driven, without the use of AI. So if you want to support our channel, consider subscribing and use the bell icon to get notifications on when the next Wars of the World video is released. Thank you for watching.